As we continue our weekly tradition of meeting with senators and representatives in their own homes, we're pleased to be at the ranch of Senator Charlie Scott. Senator, thank you so much for having us today.
Well, we're glad to have you here. We're obviously proud of the ranch, and it's what I do for a living and continue to do for a living.
You were telling me this is one of the oldest homes in Natrona County.
We think it's probably the oldest or the second oldest home that anybody still lives in. There were older homes in Casper, but they were torn down to make room for the downtown area, which is where they were. So this was built 1892, 1896, we don't know for sure, somewhere in there. And it's got a little history to it.
Our viewers now are looking at your hobby,
Yeah,
your trains.
yeah.
Why the interest in trains?
Well, my grandfather was always interested in them. He'd done a lot of traveling all over the Old South in the before the First World War, and he'd gotten an interest in them. My dad was somewhat interested in them, and I had electric trains as a kid. I've still got some of that set, and I've just always had an interest in it, and I continue to, and then continue. Wish we had Amtrak here in Wyoming.
Sure.
But we don't.
I think an interest is an understatement. You've added on to the house. You have made these intricate renditions of buildings, the Douglas Stockyard and others, depots that we've seen. It's beautiful work.
Yeah, it's something that's entirely separate from ranching and legislating. It's a hobby.
Let's talk about your time as in the legislature. Mm-hmm. No one has served in Wyoming's legislature for a longer period of time than you. Have you reflected about that?
Well, some, I guess. When I started out, I had no idea that was going to happen. But it has, and I've enjoyed it. I would guess that I spend these days 2/3 of my working time ranching and 1/3 on legislature. And they're very different. The ranching is hard physical labor. It's outside, outdoor work. I do the flood irrigating on this place, or a lot of it. And it's a challenge of running a small business. The legislature is, you get into all kinds of different things. It's intellectually challenging. It's putting together something that will work for everybody. And it's how a free people governs itself. So it's been very interesting, very challenging, and it makes for a full life, interesting life.
You moved to Natrona County when you were very young, or as you say, we're moved here.
Yeah. My dad was Casper's first pediatrician, and he got to Casper because he was a specialist in tropical medicine. That's it.
I'm thinking real hard here.
What happened was he graduated from medical school in 1941.
Okay.
And, the war was clearly coming. He went into the Naval Reserve because he knew he was going to have to serve. They allowed him to finish his first postdoctoral year. And he had always been interested. He was interested in birds. He was interested in nature, and he knew quite a bit about mosquitoes. So the Navy said, "You're an expert in tropical medicine because you know something about mosquitoes." And he wound up
There's the link then.
in Klamath Falls, Oregon, at a Marine base there where they were bringing back Marines that had fought down the South Pacific that were full of malaria and filariasis and other tropical diseases. Because part of the cure for tropical diseases is get the sufferer out of the tropics so he can't get reinfected. And my dad was part of the team that was treating him. And he and my mother liked the eastern Oregon landscape, which is very similar to Wyoming. And I was actually born at the Marine base in Klamath Falls, Oregon. I had to send in for a copy of the birth certificate, and it reads rural Oregon, and then it says Navy Dispensary, Marine Barracks.
There you go.
And so when he finished, he completed his obligation, and he had to go to Greece for a year because he hadn't been overseas during the war. Came back, got out of the Navy, did his residency training in pediatrics in Cleveland, and came looking for a place to go into practice in this part of the world that was like what they'd liked in Eastern Oregon, and Casper was looking for a pediatrician.
How did the ranch then come into the family?
Well, his dad had had a little farm outside of Boston, Framingham, just a hobby thing with 6, 7 milk cows on it, about 30 acres. And my dad had always liked that growing up. So he wanted to do something similar. He went into partnership with his nurse's husband on a 160-acre place in Bessemer Bend. And that was my first memories. Some of my first memories were that place, learning how to ride horses and whatnot down there. And the place next door came up for sale that was a little larger. And so he bought that instead, and then it grew and it grew and it grew. And then when I was working back in D.C. for the federal government, he came through and he said, best investment he ever made, he was going to looking for another one. And the next thing I knew, he took on a horrendous mortgage and bought this place.
Do you reflect back with a smile on your face at your time at Harvard and Harvard Business School?
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed that. Very intellectually stimulating. I was learning a lot, and I just enjoy learning things. I thrived at the business school, really liked it. They probably consider me a black sheep. By and large, their graduates do not go into politics and do not go into production agriculture. Now,
in Wyoming.
Or anywhere else.
Excuse me.
I'm running a small business, and that is in line with what the graduates do sometimes. But the rest of it's all different. But it's been a very satisfying life. You know, I've enjoyed the outdoor work of the ranch. I enjoy irrigating. People think I'm crazy, but I do.
So are you thinking about legislative issues when you're outside and working?
Sometimes. Mm-hmm. Think about all kinds of things.
Sure.
From how do you make the water get that dry spot? And what do you do with this flood?
Practical thinking.
And why'd the water show up here when it was supposed to be over there? And then you can also sometimes have time to think about all kinds of stuff.
You've watched many legislators come and go. What's different about legislating in Wyoming today back to when you started? Can you give us a feel for that?
It's surprising the number of things that are the same. We have, when we lost the county at large system, the number of women in the legislature went down. And I think the reason is women don't like the head-to-head competition of the single-member district as much. The number of Democrats has gone way down. We used to be, we'd have a slight Republican majority, but we'd have at least a third or more of the members were Democrats.
And you're a Republican. Do you do you see that as maybe not as positive for Wyoming? Are you happy about that?
Well, the Democrats we had in those days were much more conservative than you see nationally now, and that's what's happened in good part there. Some of it was the single-member district system was hard on them, but a majority of it is that the National Democratic Party has moved so far to the left that the people that when I started were the Wyoming Democrats. Eli Bebout was a Democratic representative from Fremont County. He was first elected as a Democrat. Look at him now, and he hasn't changed his opinions much. The party moved away from them. And so you don't have the balance between the two parties, but that's because the National Party switched so much. So the state has gotten a little more conservative, I think, but only a little. You still get, because we're still a citizens' legislature, where the majority of our members would be money ahead to lose their next election and stay home and tend to business. They would make more money. Under those circumstances, a member who's in that kind of a situation can tell a special interest group or a lobbyist where to get off and make it stick. And the worst they can do to you is beat you in the election. And if you're money ahead, that's not as big a deal as it might be.
You've worked,
and that makes a big difference in how a legislature operates.
Sure.
I am getting concerned that with a number of extra special committees we've developed, that we're gradually turning the legislature more toward a full-time legislature. And I think that would be a mistake. I think you wouldn't get nearly as good a result.
You're in fact contemplating a bill to maybe get rid of many of those select committees.
Yeah.
You've worked with many presidents of the Senate.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite?
The best one we ever had, I think, and I'll probably get myself in trouble this way, but I think the best one I ever saw was April Bremer Kuntz. And she was president when Governor Friedenthal came in. And she's quite conservative. And of course, he's a Democrat. And the House leader, Speaker, was Fred Parody at that time. And he wanted to take a partisan tact and, we'll be Republicans and we'll fight the Democratic governor. April went out of her way to try to get along with the governor. And just some little things. The governor's daughter was in a group that came and sang for the legislature. That happens, started the session often. Mm-hmm. And she invited Governor Friedenthal and the First Lady to come up, not so much in their official capacity, but as parents and sit on the bench in the chamber and listen to their daughter. Just little things like that. The Senate and the governor got along just fine. We got all kinds of things done, and the House had troubles. But she was very good that way. But we've never really had a dud, as they've all had their own strengths and weaknesses. And I would say both for the formal leadership, the president and the majority leader, and for the appropriations chairman, we've not, in my memory, had a total dud and a disaster. And most of them have left the institution a little better than they found it. And it's been, the Senate has been a very pleasant place to work because everybody's trying to make a contribution. There's nobody that's mean-spirited in there. And it's a very, very pleasant atmosphere to work in. The principle that seems to govern the legislature is that you can be somebody's ally one minute, their opponent the next, depending on how you happen to agree and disagree on the issues, but you don't take it personal and you're friends all the time. And that's the way life ought to be lived, and it leads to a pleasant place to work.
Might be some lessons for some national folks about that,
Yeah,
I would think.
yeah.
When might we see a Charlie Scott penned book about his legislative experience?
When I get to it.
Is that something you'd like to do?
I'd like to do it. I've written a few, I know quite a number of stories about the place. I've seen them happen real time. I'd like to do that, but I'm having trouble having time. But there are some classic stories that just illustrate what happened. And if I title it right, I can tell a few stories about non-legislative Wyoming things that I've seen.
Well, I think many in Wyoming will look forward to reading that when you get an opportunity, and I hope that you can do that. I think it would be a fascinating read.
Several legislators have, with mixed success. I think the way to do it is keep a little bit of a light hand on it, and there's some very illustrative things that are kind of humorous that happen.
Senator, before we leave you today, what concerns you the most about Wyoming's future in the next decade?
Let me say I've got a good deal of confidence in the future in the next decade and beyond. We have had a series of mineral booms and busts, but the booms are, how you deal with the booms is important. And many societies over the sweep of history have experienced this. The classic one being the Spanish and the New World gold, and it all wound up building up the economies of England and the Netherlands, and Spain did not benefit from it. The Wyoming story is the rancher who they find oil in his place and he owns the mineral rights, and he wakes up in 20 years with a hangover and a broke down Cadillac. The state has taken that story to heart and done its best to build up things that long-term will benefit us. The Permanent Mineral Trust Fund is the obvious one. But what we've done for our education system, K-12, our community college system, where I think we've got one of the best in the country, and the way we're building the University of Wyoming up, and we are really making progress there. The Hathaway Scholarships, which was the bill I sponsored, and they kept what I'm trying to do, get it endowed. That has paid big dividends. So that's something the ordinary kid can use to help to get a college education. It's one I'm very proud of, as you can tell. But we've used our resources wisely to build for the future, and I think we will continue to do that. There's always concerns, this, that, and the other thing goes wrong, and there's always day-to-day practical problems. But I think Wyoming really has a very rosy future, so I have trouble, saying this is the thing we got to really watch out. It's going to go wrong. We're doing so many things right.
You planning your re-election bid here?
That's 2 years away. We'll worry about that. At my age, you worry about that when it comes.
Senator Charles Scott, it's been a pleasure visiting with you.
you.
Thank you for joining us on this Capital Outlook Profile.